Welcome, my friends, welcome to another edition of the Corbett Report. I am your host, James Corbett, podcasting to you as always from the sunny climes of Western Japan on this 8th day of June, 2008. I'd like to remind my regular listeners, and let my new listeners know, that all of the documents, including videos and articles cited in today's episode, can be accessed from my website, CorbettReport.com. Simply go to CorbettReport.com and under today's episode, click on the Documentation tab. There you'll find a list of links to all of the documents cited in today's episode, organized by time index. I'd also like to remind my listeners that you'll be able to find a new YouTube documentary on our YouTube channel every Wednesday. Finally, I'd also like to remind my listeners to check out our articles section, where you can find articles by myself as well as frequent contributor to the Corbett Report, Dictator Hater. I'd also like to take this opportunity to remind my listeners that the Corbett Report is always soliciting articles from its listeners. All submissions can be sent to us through the contact form on the CorbettReport.com homepage. And now, without further ado, let's get to today's real news. Our first story today comes to us from CenterDaily.com, Thursday, June 5th, 2008. Bilderberg announces 2008 conference. The 56th Bilderberg meeting will be held in Chantilly, Virginia, USA, 5th to 8th of June, 2008. The conference will deal mainly with the nuclear-free world, cyber-terrorism, Africa, Russia, finance, protectionism, US-EU relations, Afghanistan and Pakistan, Islam, and Iran. Approximately 140 participants will attend, of whom about two-thirds come from Europe and the balance from North America. About one-third is from government and politics, and two-thirds are from finance, industry, labor, education, and communications. The meeting is private, in order to encourage frank and open discussion. Bilderberg takes its name from the hotel in Holland where the first meeting took place in May 1954. That pioneering meeting grew out of the concern expressed by leading citizens on both sides of the Atlantic that Western Europe and North America were not working together as closely as they should on common problems of critical importance. It was felt that regular, off-the-record discussions would help create a better understanding of the complex forces and major trends affecting Western nations in the difficult post-war period. The Cold War has now ended, but in practically all respects there are more, not fewer, common problems, from trade to jobs, from monetary policy to investment, from ecological challenges to the task of promoting international security. It is hard to think of any major issue in either Europe or North America whose unilateral solution would not have repercussions for the other. Thus, the concept of a European-American forum has not been overtaken by time. The dialogue between these two regions is still, even increasingly, critical. Our second story comes to us from PrisonPlanet.com, June 6, 2008. Hillary and Obama in secret Bilderberg rendezvous. According to news reports, Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton went out of their way to hold their long-awaited private meeting in a very specific location, not at Hillary's mansion in Washington, but in Northern Virginia, which also just happens to be the scene of the 2008 Bilderberg meeting. Obama's spokesman Robert Gibbs told the media that Obama and Clinton held a private meeting last night, but he refused to disclose where it had taken place, except that it was not at Clinton's home in Washington, as had been widely reported. Hillary campaign managers also refused to discuss the location of the rendezvous. Reporters traveling with Obama sensed something might be happening between the pair when they arrived at Dulles International Airport after an event in Northern Virginia, and Obama was not aboard the airplane, reports the Associated Press. Dulles just happens to be walking distance from the Westfields Marriott Hotel in Chantilly, where Henry Kissinger, David Rockefeller, and the rest of the Bilderberg globalists are convening. Our final story comes to us from Infowars.com, June 7th, 2008. Conspiracy of silence. Corporate media refuses to cover Bilderberg confab. Fire up the Google News search engine and enter Bilderberg and check out the results. Not one corporate media source, not the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, the Washington Post et al., deemed it appropriate to mention, even in passing, the 56th Bilderberg meeting in Chantilly, Virginia this week. The American Friends of Bilderberg, described as an offshoot Bilderberg front group that has accepted donations from the Ford Foundation to fund Bilderberg meetings, and a secretarial outpost through which Bilderberg conferences are organized, issued a press release this year, but the corporate media did not follow it up. On its face, it makes no sense that the corporate media would ignore and fail to report a confab comprised of newsworthy royal elites, chancellors, prime ministers, presidents, ambassadors, secretaries of state, Wall Street bankers and investors, CEOs of transnational corporations, and corporate media executives. It makes no sense. That is, until you realize the corporate media is owned and directed by this very same elite. In the past, darlings of the corporate media have attended Bilderberg meetings, including the late Peter Jennings of ABC, Joseph C. Harsh of NBC, the liberal Bill Moyers of PBS, the conservative William F. Buckley Jr., Robert L. Bartley of the Wall Street Journal, the neocon William Kristol, Thomas L. Friedman of the New York Times, the late Katharine Graham of the CIA's favorite newspaper, The Washington Post, Leslie Stahl of CBS, and many others. Many are also members of the CFR and the Trilateral Commission. Welcome, my friends, welcome to episode 45 of the Corbett Report, Ptech and the 9/11 software. Today's episode features information that comes from corporate whistleblower Indira Singh. Regular listeners to the Corbett Report might remember Indira Singh from episode 31, Welcome to 9/11 Truth. In that audio documentary, we featured a clip from Indira Singh's presentation to the Citizens Commission on 9/11. If you want to refresh yourself with that information, please listen to episode 31 of the Corbett Report, starting at 16 minutes and 31 seconds and ending at 27 minutes and 36 seconds. That clip, which we featured in that earlier episode of the Corbett Report, featured some of Indira Singh's startling testimony about the information that she gleaned when she was working at J.P. Morgan Chase. Singh was hired as a consultant for J.P. Morgan Chase to develop the next generation of business architecture enterprise software. The software she was seeking to implement at J.P. Morgan Chase, one of the largest financial institutions in the world, was specialized cutting-edge risk architecture software that would essentially be artificially intelligent and capable of scanning through the millions of transactions taking place across the J.P. Morgan Chase institution in real time, monitoring these transactions for suspicious activity such as rogue trading, and would then be able to alert the proper people within the J.P. Morgan institution to the problem and potentially even stop the transactions from taking place. The importance, sensitivity, and sophistication of any such software necessarily led Ms. Singh to seek out the true leaders in the enterprise architecture software industry. Her research and due diligence into the issue led her to a company called Ptech. As the senior risk management consultant for one of the largest financial institutions in the world, Ms. Singh knew to trust credible, proven sources of third-party software. That's why Ptech's roster of clients immediately put them in the top echelon of software providers. Ptech's clients included some of the most sensitive organizations and agencies in the United States government, including NATO, the U.S. Armed Forces, Congress, the Department of Energy, the Department of Justice, the FBI, Customs, the FAA, the IRS, the Secret Service, and the White House. This sterling roster of clients made Indira Singh very eager to take a look at Ptech's software. However, when the Ptech representatives arrived at the J.P. Morgan Chase offices to display and present their software, Ms. Singh knew there was something wrong right away. Today we're going to do something that we haven't done since episode 20 of the Corbett Report, which featured a presentation by Webster Tarpley on the 9/11 drills. Regular listeners to the Corbett Report will remember Webster Tarpley's lecture from episode 20 on the 26 war games and drills that Webster Tarpley has identified as taking place on or around 9/11 that directly affected the U.S. Air Force's ability to counteract the hijackings that day. That was one of the key talks to get people into the deep research through which they can come to a more informed understanding of the operational aspects of 9/11 as an inside job. Likewise, the interview that we're about to present with Indira Singh gives a more informed, more detailed account of what was really taking place on 9/11 and the software that was used to help bring that about. This is an extremely important interview for anyone interested in the serious, deep research into 9/11, and is an excellent starting point from which to begin a deeper investigation of that day. I heartily recommend that my listeners check out this interview in its entirety, and again, please go to the documentation list on CorbettReport.com for a link to the original source file of this audio interview so you can listen to it in its entirety. Today I present an extended audio extract from this interview, conducted by Bonnie Faulkner of KPFA's Guns and Butter in 2005. This extract begins with Indira Singh explaining what happened when Ptech arrived in her office.
Well, they came a little late. Immediately there were some issues with how the day would proceed. For instance, they showed up without the agreed-on software in hand. The most important thing about it is that their chief scientist, Dr. Hussein Ibrahim, came. He's an Egyptian-American, and he had a very good reputation in the field, very bright, someone you would like working with, very knowledgeable. But they had showed up without the software, and what I had done was isolated a workstation, took it off the net. After all, we were testing whether the software would meet our criteria, and if I had said it did, then that would be a big deal if it subsequently couldn't. So I needed to start with an out-the-box version of Ptech. They didn't bring that, and Dr. Ibrahim said, that's not a problem. We can develop the demo on his laptop. And if you know anything about these things, that's like a no-no, because at the end of the day, he's walking out the door, and I don't have anything. And he's walking away with pretty much enough of how we're thinking about doing operational risk. Now, operational risk is about how to spot bad things that are going on in a financial institution, things like rogue trading, money laundering, and so on and so forth. And it's very subtle. Our intellectual property, at least what JP Morgan was hiring me for, was to think innovatively out of the box for the next generation. How do you proactively design a blueprint to spot these things? And that's pretty big. People are smart enough to get an idea, oh, they're thinking of going down this road. That's a big deal. So I was a risk person, so I'm very aware of not to expose our intellectual property or that of the company I am consulting for. I'm very protective of that. So they showed up without the software, and that was a huge enough red flag that I began paying attention to them. A couple other things went on, and within half an hour I just walked over to the same people who had recommended them and began calling, and I said to one of them, I have the Ptech people here. And the reaction was not the reaction I would have ever expected. It was, what are they doing on site? And I said, well, you recommended them. And they said, no, you should have come through a distributor, an American distributor. And I said, JP Morgan reserves a right to work directly with the company, and besides which they are a preferred vendor of IBM. They're a preferred vendor program, and that's the way we work. We don't work through small distributors. If we're going to go with this software as a standard, we're going to go right to the source and make the agreements there. So I said, what is the problem? And basically this person said, don't let them out of your sight. And that's when my stomach sank. So you have to understand how all of a sudden I'm beginning to see these people in a different way, because when they said, don't let them out of your sight, I have a Middle Eastern company there, and we're taught not to discriminate, and that was not something that I was about to do. And to prove that they were there being evaluated. So that is never, going to be a bone of contention, although later people made that an issue. But if I had a problem working with a Middle Eastern company, they would have never been there in the first place, much less before Ground Zero closed. And no problem whatsoever having them up there. I like the idea.
What do you mean Ptech was a Middle Eastern company?
Well, that's what subsequently was revealed in the phone call, that their financier, their funders, their investors were all Saudis. And I said, so what? And they said one Saudi has been placed on the U.S. terror list, October 12th, 2001. And I said, it got very quiet. I said, you better have proof of that, because having thrown that into my lap now, this is not something that I can ignore. I have to follow up on it. This is not something I can ignore or pretend would go away or have someone else handle. This is risk management at the highest levels of one of the largest banks in the world. It is my responsibility to deal with this. And I said, how can I get proof of this? And that's when they started saying, you need to talk to Jeff Goins, who was one of the only 3 people in Ptech who knew of this relationship. You see, it was that well hidden within Ptech. And so I subsequently called Jeff Goins and I said, well, if this is true, did you not report this? Ptech is a private company, so this relationship would have been privy only to those on the inside. I said, did you report it anywhere that someone who has been placed on the U.S. terror list is key funder, angel investor to a company whose software is utilized at the highest levels of almost every government and military and defense organization in this country, including the Secret Service, the FBI, the Department of Defense, the House of Representatives, the Treasury Department, the IRS, the U.S. Navy, the U.S. Air Force, and last but not least, the Federal Aviation Administration.
Are you saying these were all Ptech clients?
These were all Ptech clients, and when I was evaluating them, I was pretty impressed. Why not Ptech? Exactly. They're being used at the highest levels of all of these organizations. So I was very excited about using them and having their software be able to be at the heart of what I wanted to develop. And I had no reason to believe that if they were in use everywhere at that caliber, that I would have a problem. They're also used in Enron. Perhaps I should have thought twice about that, but they're at use in IBM, of course, and the top accounting firms, and even in the FBI. In MITRE.
What is MITRE?
MITRE is a large company that does specialized technology for defense and intelligence. You would not expect to have an exposure with a company that was so well entrenched and embedded in these kinds of organizations.
So what about the meeting? Then did they leave? What happened?
Because basically my position was until I had proof, I could not react. That would have been very unprofessional of me. And so I thought of a number of scenarios that could be going on at that point. I thought it might have been, competitiveness, out of control, distributors wanting the JP Morgan account. It could have been anything. However, the one thing that was true is that the chief investor, Sheikh Yassin Qadi, was indeed placed on the U.S. terror list, because while I was talking to them, while they were still there, I checked out a website that had a list of everyone who had been placed on the terror list. The missing piece was, of course, proving that Sheikh Yassin Qadi was indeed affiliated with Ptech, was an owner of Ptech, because it was a private company. You could say that anybody was an investor, any bad guy or good guy was an investor. Proving it was another thing. So I let everything ride, but I kept an eye on things. And in fact, we did have a presentation that went very, very well, because in no way, shape, or form was I going to jeopardize that.
So what happened next? Did you go on working with them, or did you start to investigate Ptech?
Well, I continued multitasking. I was working with them. I placed a few phone calls, and people got back to me later that day while they were still on premises. So I was able to separate the concerns, accomplish the task, evaluate the software anyway, start the phone calls to start getting more information. Then my report would have been, this is a software, it's used everywhere, it can do what we want it to do. However, we have this issue with the company, and present that to my superiors and let them decide.
Then did you start investigating the company?
Yes. What happened next was I spoke with Jeff Goins, and he told me that basically not only was Yasin Qadi was an investor, but that a Yakub Mirza was on the board of directors, and he had been the subject of Operation Green Quest. Many of his Herndon, Virginia vehicles and companies and financing companies had been raided in March 2002. And again, that Mirza was on the board of directors. As we spoke, other names started to come out. My head was pretty much spinning at this point, and I said, have you reported any of this to the FBI? And the answer came back, yes. So I wrote a report to the FBI, and I said, okay, if the Boston FBI has been told, I need to speak with people there, because it's not just my group that's evaluating them, it's so many other groups, but I couldn't believe that if this was all true, that Ptech was still being used by the Department of Defense. There's something a little bizarre about all of this, and really I was beginning to understand unwillingly that the world was not the way we thought of it.
Now, this person that you were discussing this with, Jeff Goins,
yeah.
Was he an employee of Ptech?
Yes, he was. He's one of the key people at Ptech. He held several important positions. He had traveled to Saudi Arabia, and he had met with Yasin Qadi, and he had met with most of the investors. His last position was vice president of sales, which for a small company is pretty significant. He worked with Ptech, helping build the company for 5 years, and he was the one that was based in Virginia, who was responsible for getting a lot of the government accounts, with, of course, Osama Ziadi, who was the president. Osama Ziadi is a Lebanese-American who, according to Jeff, got a citizenship under very questionable circumstances, which involves the INS. Now, this is all according to Jeff, so at some point later in the week, I had decided to go down to Virginia and meet with not only Jeff, but a number of other Ptech and ex-Ptech employees, because this was beginning to sound like a Tom Clancy novel, and I needed proof. I told them I needed emails, I needed documents, I needed hard evidence. But in the meantime, within a day or two, I had contacted my rep at IBM, and I said, I need to walk outside with you and talk to you about something. If you guys are thinking of getting seriously in bed with this company, I would suggest that you do some background investigation so that your clients, like JP Morgan and myself, don't end up in the situation. His name was Kyle Hilligos. Kyle told me that he, quote-unquote, wrote a book report and sent it to his legal department, and he was told to just back off the whole thing. In fact, he would don't want to have anything to do with me as I continued investigating. Jeff did get the agents at the FBI, the Boston FBI office, to call me back. And with Kyle listening in, so it wasn't just me reporting on what Jeff had said, we spoke to the FBI agent who had picked up the information that Jeff had reported on Ptech when Yasin Qadi was placed on the terror list in October 2001. Remember, this is 8 or 9 months later. So my question to him is, if you have an investigation that's ongoing, that's fine, and we don't want to get involved with it or impede it in any way. But in the meantime, this country's infrastructure is seriously exposed, and I cannot, if any of this is true, cannot, and I need some evidence, something that you can give me to hang my hat on it when I report this, that this is true, that this isn't just someone making a terrorism report, that that this is true. And basically what he said is, Indira, you're in a better position on the outside to get the proof that's needed than I am. And I asked him to check with his supervisor. I said, do you understand how serious this is to have a company with this alleged terrorism connection at the highest levels of corporate America and the U.S. infrastructure? And I said, if you don't know, we need to make you aware of this. He apparently went to his supervisor, and his supervisor had said that the position wouldn't change. Now, the Boston FBI office, you can check this out, it was rated as one of the worst in terms of corruption, and I believe the Whitey Bulger incident, the connections between the FBI and the mafia have been, how should I put it, extremely well explored in the Boston FBI office. The ex-governor of Massachusetts, I believe. Anyway, this mob character, Whitey Bulger's brother, was in a very high-level political position in Massachusetts and Boston. And in fact, if people were to read Peter Lance's book, Cover Up, He explores it very well and backs up a lot of what I had found here, the interaction between organized crime and the FBI. So when they said they weren't going to proceed,
And by they, you're talking about the FBI?
The FBI. I said, I need something to hang my hat on. And so he sent me a videotape. And the videotape, which I have here, the substance of the videotape was a news clip. It was a news clip of a CBS affiliate based in Boston called WBZ-TV. And their investigative reporting team, the I-Team, which was led by investigative reporter Joe Bergantino, had investigated a number of Middle Eastern men who were sought after 9/11. They were affiliated with Muslim Islamic terrorism financing charities. He had created this clip to show the connection between the 9/11 terror attack and the financial vehicles that were supposedly used to fund it. And what he did was very interesting. The I-Team connected Care International, not the big Care International, but something called Care International that was based in Boston, all the way back to Al-Qifa, which was the financing vehicle at the center of the World Trade Center bombing in 1993, all the way back to something called Maktab al-Khidmat, which means the office, which was a financing vehicle that was set up by the CIA for the Pakistani ISI back in the days when Osama bin Laden was America's fair-haired boy and was on our side fighting with the Mujahideen, fighting the Soviet Union. So the question to me was, my goodness, when I saw the videotape, what is Maktab al-Khidmat doing being run out of Ptech on 9/11? And the reason I say being run out of Ptech is that the faces in the videotape were the faces of core employees at Ptech. Now remember, this is a small company. There were only one or two people who had access to the source code in Ptech, and that is a very trusted position, and he was one of them. His name is Suhail Laher. The people who started Care International, some of them were actually on an FBI terror watch list prior to 9/11 in Boston.
What do you mean by the source code?
Well, all software products has some group or organization or person writes code that is then packaged up, and for instance, the word processor in your desk, the spreadsheet, and so on and so forth, the browser, is all written in some sort of code. Those are the keys to it, and if you wanted to improve it, add new functionality, you would change the original code and add new functionality and then repackage it and send it out there. So whoever had access to the source code of Ptech, that was where the value was. If you lost the source code, you essentially lost the product for all intents and purposes, marketing point of view. So only one or two people would have access to the source code. It would be like having the formula for Coca-Cola, basically.
Now, let's go over that a little bit again. Now, you were talking about the Care International and some other funding groups that have been, funding international terrorism.
That's correct.
And also have been funded by the CIA?
Well, the roots of Al-Qifa and Care International, if you look at it, were way back in the late 80s, around the time of Iran-Contra, for instance. Maktab al-Khidmat was set up so that monies could be passed to Osama bin Laden and the Mujahideen when they were fighting the Soviet. Now, I won't go into a lot of detail, but it ended up that Osama bin Laden took that over and was running Al-Qaeda through that. The connections to the Pakistani ISI still stood. The connections to the CIA still stood, not in the way that was originally set up, but through a black or a gray operation that had been later confirmed to me. At the end of the day, when I was finished with certain parts of the investigation, it was clear to me that there's no way Ptech could have done all of this without a lot of inside help. And that's what I began focusing on, that it was a cutout, that it was a front. Was it a regular CIA front? Was it a clandestine front? What was it? There are walls within the FBI, walls within the CIA, behind which these operations take place, and who is behind those operations, is a key question. Now, people might say, oh, this is all conspiracy theory, but I would like to remind people that conspiracy is very much recognized by the United States Federal Code, and it's called RICO, racketeering and influence, and it is very much recognized because there's so much power in these organizations that they have rules in place. For instance, the DCIA, the director of CIA, cannot, after his term of DCIA, subsequently run for vice president or president, which is what happened with George Herbert Walker Bush. That rule was bent for him. He went on from being the DCIA to running for vice president. That's a no-no.
I'm speaking with 9/11 whistleblower and risk technology architect Indira Singh. Today's show, Ground Zero 9/11, Blueprint for Terror, Part 2. I'm Bonnie Faulkner. This is Guns and Butter. Well, it sounds like you're describing an interlocking relationship then between this software company funded by Saudis and funded by whomever, the United States government, U.S. corporations, and then known groups globally that are accused of staging terrorist attacks. It's all of a piece.
Yes, absolutely. And one of the things I want to say is maybe those organizations don't fully know who their masters are. And Ptech is the one thread, the one golden thread you pull on. All of this is unraveled because it goes into the corporations, it goes into these government entities, it goes into the terrorism financing entities that none of which have been, oh, by the way, taken to task. And there are just so many questions about what does this all mean. And as I investigated further, we found that the origins of Ptech were very interesting. Where did this company come from, obviously, is the first question. And how did they get to be so powerful? Who were the people? Who were the organizations that brought them in? Who knew? Who gave them the power? Who, for instance, signed off Ziadi's U.S. citizenship without doing background checks? Who said that they had a bad feeling doing that? Who gave them influential... I remember that Ptech's competitors, U.S. companies, were extremely annoyed at the fact that they could not get equal time, that all the plum contracts were going to a foreign-owned company. And I said, well, did you know they were foreign-owned? And if they're foreign-owned, they couldn't get certain classified projects. And he said, Indira, everyone knew. Some of the competitors said everyone knew that they were Saudi-owned, and that meant that they got favorable treatment in Capitol Hill. And I said, well, are you saying that they just got favored treatment, or if there was something more going on, they wouldn't answer? Their lawyers instructed them not to answer, so they knew a lot of what was going on.
Who were you talking to about this?
Well, in one particular case, I was talking to one of their competitors, Popkin Software. And, I have no problem naming names because I think that in the memory of 3,000 U.S. civilians and worldwide civilians who were murdered, if we are going to wage wars and spill blood around the world, we ought to take a look at this and just have the truth come out. Because the truth has not come out. There's been a lot of speculation, there's been a lot of innuendo, but there hasn't been hard proof. And Ptech is the one situation where you can get hard proof. When we investigated Ptech and the people behind it, where they came from, we found out that one of the founding members was a man by the name of Solomon Bahari. He was one of the founding directors, and he had put together a vehicle called BMI, which stands for Baitul Mal. Now, BMI was, identified as being involved with terror financing, but this is just not going to be the Muslims hate America. That's not what it is. There is something else going on here. They're being used as a tool, just as the good people of the United States are being used, are being misled into and frightened and terrorized into, if we don't wage these horrific wars, our way of life will be over. Who benefits from that?
What else did your investigation of Ptech turn up? Didn't you meet with several employees or former employees of Ptech?
Yes. It goes back to when all of this was being revealed to me. Now, this is the last week of May 2002. The last day, or June 1 or so of 2002, lo and behold, out of nowhere, the Chicago FBI enters the picture. We have Agent Robert Wright, the Chicago FBI, who's giving congressional testimony, and he stands on the steps of the Capitol, bursts into tears, apologizes to the 9/11 families, victims, that he didn't do everything he could to prevent 9/11 from happening, that his investigations were repeatedly shut down. And I almost fell over, because he announced that his investigation was an investigation into Yasin Qadi, this same Sheikh Yasin Qadi who was the money man behind Ptech. And you could not ask for a more direct connection to 9/11 than that. I will even discount the fact that some ex-Ptech employees told me that when I went to see them, I presented all the terror list faces and whatever, and they had indicated that they had seen some pass through Ptech. In fact, one or two had mentioned that they thought one of the hijackers had actually passed through Ptech. And I said, did you report this to the FBI? Can you tell me when? Can you get evidence of it? Can you get litigation quality evidence, something that would stand up? Whatever you can get, give it to me. Make copies. Give it to the FBI. I still thought they were on our side.
The FBI, you mean?
The FBI. In fact, and this has to be made very clear, there are some extraordinarily real patriotic Americans and good people in the FBI, as has been said by, I believe, Agent Colleen Rowley, one of the FBI whistleblowers, bosses, that there's a wall in the FBI. And this has been validated to me by various attorneys in Houston who are very close to the power bases and are pretty ticked off at what's happening in this country and are speaking out, as are many CIA agents who are very concerned that it has gone too far, as are many NSA agents who are concerned that it's gone too far, and FBI agents. So we have a lot of people who are speaking out. They've kept quiet too long. They're afraid. They're afraid of what's happening to this country. And when I say the Third Reich, what is happening to this country, they say, and I will identify they, if pressed, they say will make the Third Reich look like a Tea Party. I guess we have that many more billion people to control on this planet.
And when you say they say, are you referring to people that you've spoken with in the FBI?
Absolutely. Within the FBI, within the CIA. One of the things I didn't want to have happen is that when Ptech was finally raided in December 2002, something that took all of 6 months, a tremendous amount of agony to have happen, the White House, Ari Fleischer, spun it to find sugar that day. He said, oh, there's nothing wrong, nothing here, nothing to see here, everything's fine. So they did a token raid, and that was basically it. But everything that I have done since that time has been for one reason and one reason only, that there may come a time that people will find the trail to Ptech, and it won't be hidden or buried. I've kept it alive. Whether they renamed their company and moved on, I want to keep the names, the details, everything alive, no matter what I have to do, so that should there come a time for justice and accounting for 9/11 and for what's happening in the world today, it makes it easier for other people to unravel the truth. So I have gone to the mainstream press. I've gone to people on the left, on the left, on the right of right, and I've talked to them face to face and said, this is wrong. Whatever your political inclinations, this is wrong. This is criminal. This is murder. This is worldwide atrocity. And I have reached some very good people on the left and on the right who are willing to speak out about Ptech. I've contacted the alternative press. The alternative press has, very much like the Nine Blind Men and the Elephant, they touch a piece of Ptech, they understand it, and they say, well, this fits my theory of how things went wrong. I have no problem with that, because the facts are the facts. If someone wants to spin it to fit their particular viewpoint, for instance, from the Wilderness has said that, well, the software that's in Ptech is very much like PROMIS, the Prosecutor's Management Information System that has a whole cargo cult behind it of these legendary capabilities. Well, maybe back in the 80s and 90s it was legendary, but today you can do pretty amazing things with software. It's not a big deal. But anyway, from the Wilderness and Mike Rupert, for instance, thesis was that Dick Cheney was running an alternate command and control center that day, confusing everyone. And in fact, there were 4 war games that were going on 9/11. And who knows why the fighters weren't scrambled in time? Who knows all of this? In fact, the fighter to Pennsylvania was scrambled in time because we have firsthand proof, whistleblowers within the correct organizations that was shot down. It's just that Let's Roll was a better story, perhaps a story that the American people could handle. But no, I was told at Ground Zero that day, we heard them go over and we knew they were shot down. We were told. It was just later that we were told, well, the passengers brought it down. Well, if you're running a country and you're really under terrorist attack, that might be the way to go. Empower people by saying, if this bad thing happens to you, get up and do something and have a story. I really don't have such a big problem with that, but the fact of the matter is it was shut down.
Oh, and that's interesting. And you heard that on the day of September 11th.
Yes, I did. And it was corroborated a couple of weeks ago by people who were in a particular situation room.
Did you want to say anything more about that?
Well, it is possible that there was an alternate command and control system that could you technically use Ptech software to do surveillance and intervention? Well, gosh, yes, that's exactly what I was planning on using it for in one of the largest banks in the world. It's not a problem. So if someone wants to make it their thesis, I have no problem with that. However, I can't say for sure that was going on because I don't have direct firsthand, knowledge of that. No one has told me and offered me proof of that. But could I state that it could happen? Absolutely, it could have happened. Was it necessary for it to have happened in order for us to have a 9/11? I don't know. I don't think so. Maybe, maybe not. That's not my point. The towers came down, 3,000 people were killed, and what I know is the characters behind the funding of it were totally in bed with characters in the United States, and not only just for 9/11, but going on throughout our nation's history. And the big question is why? What are they up to?
Could you describe the relationship of Ptech with the FAA? Now, Ptech worked with the FAA for several years, didn't they?
Yes, they worked the FAA. It was a joint project between Ptech and MITRE, and they were looking at, it's interesting, they were looking at basically holes in the FAA's interoperability with responding with other agencies, law enforcement, in the case of an emergency such as a hijacking. So they were looking for the escalation process, what people would do, how they would respond in case of an emergency, and find the holes and make recommendations to fix it. Now, if anyone was in a position to understand where the holes were, Ptech was, and that's exactly the point. And if anybody was in a position to write software to take advantage of those holes, it would have been Ptech.
Now, was there a reference to Ptech having operated in the basement out of the FAA?
Yes. Now, typically, because the scope of such projects are so overarching and wide-ranging, when you are doing an enterprise architecture project, you pretty much have access to how anything in the organization is being done, where it's being done, on what systems, what the information is, and you pretty much have carte blanche. If it's a major project that spans several years, the team that comes in has literally access to almost anything that they want because you're operating on a blueprint level, on a massive scale. So, yes, they were everywhere, and I was told that they were in places that required clearances. I was told that they had log-on access to FAA flight control computers. I was told that they had passwords to many computers that you may not on the surface think has anything to do with finding out holes in the system. But let's say you've said, okay, you isolated a part of a process of notification process that was mediated by a computer and you wanted to investigate it further, then you would typically get log-on access to that computer. And from that, back upstream or downstream. So who knows? From my own experience, I could have access to almost anything I wanted to in JP Morgan Chase. And didn't, for the reason if anything went wrong, I didn't want to have the access. But if you were up to no good as an enterprise architect with such a mandate, you typically could have anything you wanted, access to anything.
What do you think of the claim by the so-called 9/11 Independent Commission and the testimony before it in their report? The intelligence agencies didn't know how to talk to each other. What did you think of their so-called report?
Completely flawed. Governor Kaine was the second choice for the head of the commission. I believe Henry Kissinger was the first. Governor Kaine had, oh, by the way, done business deals with BMI, Salman Bahari, Ptech, none of which came out, which he should have volunteered and either recused himself as being ahead or have it out there in the open. There were 3 other members of the commission who had similar kinds of relationships in the past. And they were all on the team. But their findings were so flawed. They're using an excuse. Yes, there are interoperability communication issues in any organization. Yes, they are. But in the case of an emergency, it doesn't get that bollocksed up. Unless, of course, Rupert is right and Cheney was running interference somewhere or someone was running interference or whoever. We don't know. But there were 4 war games, 4 simulations going on the morning of 9/11. And I just want people to remember that the whole nature of what MITRE, which is also, they developed software for intelligence, which includes the CIA, MITRE and Ptech, would have, if they were going to test whether they had fixed these holes, would have probably run a simulation. I don't know that they did, but that's how we do things. But there were 4 of them going on. So was there room for confusion? I don't think these people were stupid. I think they were deliberately confused, if anything.
Well, we know very well that there was a simulation of the very event taking place during the event,
yes.
Right?
Yes, there was. And I believe there's proof there was more than one, just in case the first one didn't confuse people enough. So what does this say? I can be very objective about this and say, well, the terrorists knew that there were war games scheduled for this day and they took advantage of it and called 9/11 the particular day. However, we do know that 9/11 had been selected prior. Okay, so then maybe the war games were set many weeks prior for 9/11. And you can play this game over and over and over. Yes, it was the perfect day. And yes, you needed inside knowledge. And yes, Ptech, with all its myriad associations, would have had the inside knowledge. And yes, Ptech was a CIA front. And yes, Ptech was protected. So was it an inside job? You don't have to look at this indirectly. This is direct. This requires direct investigation.
Again, that's a stunning interview, jam-packed with incredible information that goes to the very heart of 9/11. And I suggest that people who find this information important and find the controlled corporate media's complete blackout on this information reprehensible do their own part to get this word out by spreading the word about Indira Singh and this breakthrough interview. Remarkably enough, considering the bombshell information provided by this corporate whistleblower, Indira Singh, about this company, which actually operated in the basement of the FAA with complete and total access to every operational detail, including their management of interoperability systems with NORAD that could have directly affected the response of NORAD on 9/11. Absolutely nothing has resulted from the FBI investigation of this company and its links to terror. One of the ridiculous PR pieces put out by the Mass High Tech Business Journal comes from Friday, August 22nd, 2003, and it's entitled Wherewithal, Wrongly Suspected Ptech CEO Bounce Back Slowly. The article reads in part, Osama Ziad's business has suffered millions in losses this year, none of which can be attributed to a limp economy. His lost millions can be attributed to his devastated professional reputation due to a bogus tip to federal investigators and ensuing bad press. Really bad press. On December 4th, Ziad's business, Ptech, had been recognized as one of the top 10 companies that matter by KM World for 3 years running, as well as one of the fastest-growing tech companies in New England by Deloitte & Touche. Ptech is a global supplier of software that helps clients visualize and analyze tech infrastructure and builds models for business planning. Clients include governmental agencies such as the FBI, the IRS, the Federal Aviation Administration, and the Secret Service. Business was good until December 5th, when Ptech was visited by federal investigators acting on a tip that a company investor had links to Al-Qaeda and that Ptech may have designed a back door in its software allowing terrorist entry to the above-named clients' databases. Ziad cooperated, saying he had nothing to hide, while the government took measures to come late at night, in the hope that its visit would be stealthy. It wasn't. The following day, Ziad opened the newspaper and saw his photo next to a story describing a raid on Ptech to investigate possible terrorist links. He became really scared. "It was a nightmare. I took my family out of the house immediately," he says. "I thought, what if someone comes to my house? I was in a bad situation." It would be 30 days before he'd sleep through the night. In the meantime, he had to lay off a dozen employees because in the following 2 months, business fell off by $3 million. It seemed many customers didn't want to do business with a perceived terrorist sympathizer, while those who knew Ptech and its founder extended kindness. By March, things started to get a little better. Word came directly from the White House, making official what the feds thought all along, that there is no terrorist connection to Ptech, nor was there ever any backdoor in the software. End quote. Again, that incredible, mindless whitewash article, which provides no evidence whatsoever about the very real links of top Ptech investors to terrorist organizations, was run in Mass High-Tech Business Journal in 2003. Just how ridiculous that whitewash is becomes clear in an excellent article from FrontPageMagazine.com called The Business of Terror by Dr. Rachel Ehrenfeld. This article comes from June 17, 2005, and reads in part, quote, "On May 11, 2005, Muhammad Mubayed was arrested and charged in Boston's District Court for filing false tax returns on behalf of Care International, for which he acted as treasurer. Mubayed was also the customer services manager of the company known as Ptech, a privately owned technology company based in Quincy, Massachusetts. Ptech, which recently changed its name to Go Agile, developed a software, also called Ptech, that was used primarily to develop enterprise blueprints that held every important functional, operational, and technical detail of a given enterprise. Mubayed is only the latest of Ptech's top investors and managers to run afoul with the law. Mubayed personifies the interlinks of the complex infrastructure which were established by Al-Qaeda and other Islamist organizations in the U.S. But Mubayed was not arrested for his connection with Al-Qaeda. Rather, he was charged for making false statements and conspiring to defraud the U.S. by misrepresenting CARE's activities, which involved the solicitation and expenditure of funds to support and promote the Mujahideen and Jihad, including the distribution of pro-Jihad publications. CARE International is the now-defunct Muslim charity that was originally the Boston branch office of the Al-Khaifa Refugee Center in Brooklyn, New York, from which Sheikh Omar Abdel Rahman funded and plotted the 1993 World Trade Center bombing. CARE International was already publicly identified as supporting Al-Qaeda back in 2002, yet it remained open, and several of its employees worked and or were affiliated with Ptech. Ptech was raided by the FBI on December 6, 2002, following a tip from an employee who suspected that the company was connected to the 9/11 attacks. Indeed, on October 12, 2001, Yassin Al-Qadi, Ptech's top investor at that time, was listed by the U.S. government as a specially designated global terrorist for his support of Al-Qaeda. Al-Qadi invested at least $18 million directly in Ptech, $5 million through the Isle of Man, and $9 million indirectly through BMI, a now defunct New Jersey-based Islamic investment firm with connections to other members on Ptech's management and investors. Al-Qadi also transferred $2 million to Ptech from Switzerland between 1997 and 2000, according to Swiss investigators. Al-Qadi's businesses extended throughout the world and included banking, diamonds, chemicals, construction, transportation, and real estate. It would be hard to find a more strategically placed individual to advance the agenda of al-Qaeda or any other terrorist organization. Qadi is still at large, and according to recent media reports, expanding his business in Asia. The identities and connections of some other Ptech investors and managers should have also raised a red flag. Even Ptech removed from its website the names of several board members and or their affiliations after a Wall Street Journal expose on December 6, 2002. End quote. All of that carefully researched article is backed up by another article, also incredibly well researched and definitely worth looking into, from the AmericanMonitor.com. This article is from January 16, 2007, and is headlined, Ptech Owners' Assets Confiscated in Albania. It reads in part, quote, the Albanian government has seized the assets of a wealthy Saudi that, for several years, reportedly maintained simultaneous connections to both al-Qaeda and the U.S. government while serving the interests of the CIA. The finance ministry said it ordered authorities to block 4 apartments, a house, 4 bars and shops, and more than 2 hectares, about 5 acres of land, belonging to Yassin al-Qadi, the Associated Press reports, citing the official gazette. Yassin al-Qadi, the owner of the property according to the U.S. Treasury Department, heads the Saudi-based Muwafaq Foundation, an al-Qaeda front that receives funding from wealthy Saudi businessmen. The Treasury has thus identified the prominent entrepreneur as a specially designated global terrorist. Despite his alleged affiliations to terrorism, al-Qadi has maintained concurrent contracts within influential Washington circles. Despite his alleged affiliations to terrorism, al-Qadi has maintained concurrent contacts within influential Washington circles. In fact, prior to being publicly connected to money laundering and terrorist financing, al-Qadi regularly spoke of his relationship with Vice President Dick Cheney. Al-Qadi, who has been identified as one of Osama bin Laden's chief money launderers, owned a prominent U.S. technology firm and alleged CIA front known as Ptech. He also escorted U.S. officials around during their visits to Saudi Arabia. As reported by the Associated Press, al-Qadi allegedly worked with Osama bin Laden to provide support to terrorist networks in Albania, prompting the recent confiscation of his assets in that country. According to the Associated Press, al-Qadi used 6 different names for the recently seized assets, all of which were in the Tirana area, Albania's capital city. One charity to allegedly launder money in Albania for the al-Qaeda network was Yassin al-Qadi's Muwafaq Foundation. Khalid bin Mahfouz, an extremely influential and wealthy Saudi who established and funded the Muwafaq Foundation, was once the principal shareholder and director of BCCI, a criminal enterprise used by the CIA during the 1980s to funnel cash to Osama bin Laden for the anti-Soviet jihad in Afghanistan. As former DEA undercover agent Michael Levine explained to The New American in 1999, the U.S. armed and funded the worst elements of the Mujahideen in Afghanistan: drug traffickers, arms smugglers, anti-American terrorists. We later paid the price when the World Trade Center was bombed in 1993, and we learned that some of those responsible had been trained by us. Now we're doing the same thing with the KLA. These guys, Levine said, referring to the KLA, have a network that's active on the streets of this country. They're the worst elements of society that you can imagine, and now, according to my sources in drug enforcement, they're politically protected. According to Yusuf Bodansky, director of research of the International Strategic Studies Association, the role of the Albanian mafia, which is tightly connected to the KLA, is laundering money, providing technology, safe houses, and other supports to terrorists within this country. In any case, Bodansky told The New American, a serious investigation of the Albanian mob isn't going to happen because they're our boys. They're protected. This may help explain why, according to FBI whistleblower Robert Wright, his investigation into Yassin al-Qadi during the 1990s was intentionally and repeatedly thwarted and obstructed by higher-ups at the FBI. According to Agent Wright, who seized $1.4 million directly linked to al-Qaeda in 1998, FBI intelligence agents lied and hid vital records from criminal agents for the purpose of obstructing his criminal investigation of the terrorists in order to protect their subjects, and prolong their intelligence operations, as reported by the group questioning Wright, Judicial Watch. The supervisor who was there from headquarters was right straight across from me and started yelling at me, "You will not open criminal investigations. I forbid any of you. You will not open criminal investigations against any of these intelligence subjects," Agent Wright told ABC News in 2002. According to Agent Wright and other members of his former unit, the money trails of the 1998 African embassy bombings led back to Al-Qadi, but even after the bombings, FBI headquarters wanted no arrests. According to Agent Wright, it is very likely that 9/11 would have been prevented if he had simply been allowed to do his job. End quote. Again, the importance of all of this information cannot be underestimated. Special Agent Robert Wright said he was investigating a company with 26 subsidiaries, and when he was referring to that, he was referring to BMI, the larger organization which had Ptech as one of the jewels in its crown. And it later came out that the head of the 9/11 Commission, Governor Kane, actually sold a piece of property in New Jersey through BMI Inc. What does it mean that Robert Wright's investigation into BMI and Ptech and the global terrorist financiers was shut down, and that the person who was appointed to head the 9/11 Commission after Kissinger didn't make the grade with the 9/11 victims' family members, actually had dealings with that company? For more information on that, please look into FBI agent Robert Wright and the claims that he made in September 2002 that the FBI was continuing to protect terrorists from criminal investigations. And for even more information on the cover-up, I suggest an article entitled "Michael Chertoff and the Sabotage of the Ptech Investigation," which details how Chertoff was involved in a turf war with the FBI for control over Operation Greenquest, the Special Customs Investigation Force, which Indira Singh cited in that interview with Bonnie Faulkner, that was charged with finding and tracking down international sources of funding for global terrorists. Perhaps it's no surprise and no coincidence that after Chertoff gained control of Operation Greenquest, it became completely ineffectual, as evidenced by an article on the counterterrorism blog by Christopher Heffelfinger called Operation Greenquest Unresolved, which notes that this massive multi-agency initiative has not yet yielded any convictions, and that was as of October 2007. For those wondering what's happened to Indira Singh since 2005, well, you might want to join the club. She has gone underground in the last 3 years, presumably as a way of staying safe, while she continues to research and write her book about the Ptech investigation and the various links that she has uncovered through that investigation. She has recently resurfaced, however, to write a memorial to Michael Corbett, a radio talk show host who has interviewed Indira Singh before, and who died under mysterious circumstances in March of this year. I direct listeners again to the documentation list for this episode, from which they can find a link to Indira Singh's memorial to Michael Corbett, and also to the interviews that Michael Corbett conducted with Indira Singh, in which she goes even further into naming the names behind Ptech and her investigations into the global terrorist financing ring. Again, this is the deep research which really will expose those people who had a hand in not only perpetrating, but in then covering up the attacks of 9/11, and the sophisticated enterprise architecture, that software that they used to help bring those attacks about. It's my hope that this episode of the Corbett Report does not present all of the answers to what happened on 9/11 in one neat little package, but I do hope that it presents enough information to get you thinking and get you started on your own research. It's only by the collective efforts of a community united in a common cause of exposing the real culprits of 9/11 that we can ever hope to achieve 9/11 justice. Please get out there and use these articles and this interview as a basis for your own deep research. And please keep the Corbett Report updated on your research. Again, I invite all my listeners to submit articles to the Corbett Report through the contact function of the CorbettReport.com homepage.